There are places in the world that seem to hold a strange, unsettling silence, a kind of stillness that weighs heavily on your chest. Deep within the Sierra Mountains, in a remote region of dense forests and jagged peaks, lies such a place, an area that most would call impossible to navigate, let alone explore. No one dares to venture too far into these mountains unless absolutely necessary. Even the locals, accustomed to the wilderness, avoid this region after sundown. And yet, that's where I found myself one fateful afternoon, on the edge of something I could never have anticipated. It was a quiet trip, an escape from the noise of everyday life, a chance to clear my mind. I had heard stories, of course. Everyone had. But they were just stories, weren't they? Legends passed down through generations, told to scare children and keep them close to home. The kind of tales that live on through hushed whispers at family gatherings. But like most people, I thought those stories were just that, stories. The locals called it La Sierra Maldita, the cursed Sierra. They spoke in low voices, their eyes darting around nervously whenever the subject came up. And always with a warning, don't go up there alone. But I wasn't afraid. I figured I was smart enough to handle myself. And the truth is, I had heard the whispers about La Llorona, every version of the legend that echoed through the region. I knew it was said she roamed the mountains, searching for lost souls to carry away with her. Still, it seemed like the kind of myth that belonged in stories, not in real life. So one morning, when the sky was clear and the sun promised a perfect day of exploration, I packed my backpack and set out alone. I was eager for the solitude of the mountains, the peace of being so far away from the rest of the world. The hike began calmly, with nothing but the sound of my boots crunching against the gravel and the distant calls of birds circling high above. The air was thin but refreshing, and I felt at peace with myself. As I ventured deeper into the wilderness, the path grew narrower, more difficult to follow. The trees were thicker here, their gnarled branches twisting like the fingers of long-forgotten spirits reaching for the sky. The sunlight struggled to pierce the canopy, casting long shadows that made it feel as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Despite my earlier confidence, a cold shiver of unease began to creep up my spine. I stopped for a moment to check my map, only to realize I had strayed from the trail. No matter, I thought, I would just follow the sound of the stream I had heard earlier. I couldn't be far off track. That was when I first heard it. A soft, mournful cry carried on the wind, so faint at first that I thought it was just a trick of the breeze. But then it came again, louder this time, closer. It was unmistakable. The sound of a woman weeping, soft yet sharp, like a broken heart, echoed through the trees. At first, I dismissed it as an animal's cry or the wind carrying some strange noise. But as I stood there listening, I felt an unsettling chill in the air. The sound was coming from deeper in the forest, beyond the trees. Something was off. Something was wrong. I glanced around, my instincts suddenly on high alert. I knew I wasn't alone. That was when I remembered the old warnings, never go alone after dark. But it was still early, wasn't it? No reason to turn back just yet. Besides, I was curious now. What if it was just a lost traveler or someone in need of help? But then the cry came again, louder and filled with desperation. This time I couldn't ignore it. It was too real, too human. And I could feel something inside me that urged me to leave, to turn back before I ventured any deeper. Before I continue, if you enjoy stories like this, stories of real terror, mysterious legends, and haunting encounters, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps these stories alive, and I have many more to share with you. Now back to my story. The Sierra Mountains are more than just jagged peaks and dense forests. They are a place where the past refuses to stay buried. The locals, those few who live near the edge of these wild lands, will tell you in hushed voices about the terrible specter that haunts the high ridges and deep ravines. It's not the version of La Llorona that you've heard of in other parts of the world, the one weeping beside rivers, searching for her lost children. No, this is a far darker, more vengeful spirit. They call her La Llorona de la Sierra. The legend goes back hundreds of years, long before modern eyes set foot in these mountains. It is said that there was once a woman, beautiful and young, who lived in a small village nestled deep within the mountains. She had a family, a husband and 2 children, a boy and a girl. For years, they lived peacefully, tucked away from the rest of the world, surrounded by the wild beauty of the mountains. But happiness, as it often does, was fleeting. One fateful night, after a storm had passed through the mountains, a terrible tragedy struck. Her children, just children, were playing near the edge of a cliff, unaware of the storm that had washed loose the rocks above. A massive landslide swept them both away, burying their tiny bodies beneath tons of debris. The mother's grief was immeasurable, her heart broken beyond repair. For days she searched the mountains, calling their names, weeping as she wandered. Her sorrow was so great, the pain so intense, that it is said the very earth trembled with her cries. She begged the heavens to return her children, but the mountains were silent. Her mind began to unravel. Desperation turned to madness, and madness turned to rage. She blamed anyone who dared to cross her path, for how could they be so carefree while her world had been destroyed? One evening, after losing herself completely to grief, the woman stood at the top of a mountain, gazing down into the valley below where her children had once played. She cursed the heavens and swore that she would never stop searching for her children, even if it meant taking others to join them. And so she became La Llorona de la Sierra. Now she is said to haunt these mountains, forever searching for those lost souls who dare to wander too far into her domain. Her mournful wails echo through the trees, carried by the wind, sometimes soft, sometimes desperate, sometimes angry, never ceasing. And it is in these cries that you will find the true terror of La Llorona de la Sierra. She doesn't just mourn the loss of her children anymore. Her grief has twisted into a hunger for revenge. Those who venture alone into the mountains at night, the ones foolish enough to ignore the warnings, are never seen again. The locals speak of it as a curse, a shadow that follows anyone who dares to come too close to her haunted domain. They say her spirit can sense when someone enters the mountains alone. It starts with the crying, distant at first, but it gets louder the closer you get to her. Then you'll feel her presence, a coldness so deep it chills you to the bone. And when you think you've escaped, when you believe you're safe, that's when she comes. Some claim they've seen her, a figure clothed in tattered white, her hair hanging down in front of her face, her eyes hollow and empty. Others say she can take many forms, that she is the forest itself, stalking her victims from the shadows. The warnings are always the same: don't go alone. Don't go after dark. But there are those like me who believe they are immune, who think they can outsmart the old legends, or worse, that they are too strong to be overcome by such tales. But the people here know better. In these mountains, no one is ever truly alone. And if you hear the cry of La Llorona de la Sierra, it is already too late. I should have turned back. The warnings, the whispers of the locals, the old legends, they all warned me, but at that moment none of it seemed to matter. I had come to the mountains to escape, to leave behind the chaos of the world and the weight of my own thoughts. The pressures of daily life, the noise, the people, all of it was suffocating. The idea of being completely alone in nature, surrounded by nothing but trees, rock, and the sky, nothing seemed more appealing. Maybe I was a fool. Maybe the truth is, I didn't want to believe the warnings, the superstitions. After all, I had always considered myself a rational person, someone who needed to see things for themselves. Legends were for children, for those who needed an explanation for what they couldn't understand. But this was different. The mountain air, crisp and fresh, filled my lungs and pushed my doubts aside. I wasn't afraid of ghost stories, no matter how ancient or unsettling they seemed. As I made my way deeper into the mountains, the sounds of civilization faded away, replaced by the quiet hum of the forest. The wind whispered through the trees, the occasional bird call piercing the stillness. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The higher I climbed, the more the landscape seemed to change, as if the forest itself was trying to keep something hidden. The trees grew thicker, their trunks gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. The air grew colder, thicker, and with each step, it felt as though the weight of the mountains was pressing down on me. It's funny how quickly your perception can shift. What starts as a simple hike, a search for solitude, slowly becomes something else entirely. I couldn't explain it, but as I walked, the feeling of being watched began to creep up on me, like a shadow that refused to leave my side. It wasn't obvious at first. At first, it was just the way the trees seemed to whisper as I passed, the way the shadows moved in the corners of my vision. But soon, the feeling was unmistakable. Someone was watching me. I stopped for a moment, standing still in the thickening woods, listening. The sound of my own breath was too loud, the beat of my heart too frantic. I shook my head, trying to push the thoughts away. I was being ridiculous. It was just the isolation, the stillness of the mountain playing tricks on my mind. But then I heard it, the faintest sound just beyond the reach of my senses, like a soft cry carried on the wind. At first, it was so distant that I thought I had imagined it. But then there it was again, clearer this time and unmistakably human. A woman's voice crying out in sorrow, so low it seemed to vibrate in my bones. It echoed through the trees, wrapping around me, pulling me in. I froze. I didn't know why, but a part of me felt compelled to go toward the sound. Another part of me screamed to turn around, to run back to the safety of the village. But my feet didn't listen. I was too deep now, too far from the path to turn back so easily. The deeper I ventured, the more the world around me seemed to close in. The forest felt alive as if it had a pulse, a dark, heavy pulse that matched the pounding of my heart. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches creaking and swaying, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. The air grew cold and the once clear sky overhead began to darken, as if something was blocking out the sun. The cry came again, louder now, almost close enough to touch. But it wasn't just the cry that filled me with dread. It was the silence that followed. The stillness that came after the cry. It was as if the mountains themselves had stopped breathing, waiting for something or someone. And suddenly I knew I wasn't alone. That eerie sensation, the one that had been crawling along the edges of my mind, was real. There was something in those woods, something that had been waiting, watching, following me. The trees were no longer just trees. The rocks weren't just rocks. The entire mountain had become a living, breathing entity, its very soul tied to whatever haunted it. And then, without warning, the wind picked up, howling through the trees with an unnatural force. The cry echoed again, now so close, so clear that I could almost feel the tears in the woman's voice. I wasn't alone. I turned, ready to flee, but the path I had taken was gone. The forest had shifted, closing me in. And that's when I realized I had made a terrible mistake. I had walked right into her domain. It started off so subtly, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. The wind rustled through the trees, its soft whispers barely noticeable over the pounding of my heart. But then there it was again, faint at first, a distant cry barely audible over the wind. At first I dismissed it. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. The wind, the shifting of the branches, it was natural, wasn't it? But as I continued deeper into the forest, the cries grew louder. They weren't like the usual animal sounds, not the rustling of leaves or the occasional distant screech of a bird. No, these were different. These were voices, human voices, filled with sorrow and desperation. At first it was just a soft whimper, almost drowned out by the breeze. But as I pushed forward, the sound began to sharpen, becoming clearer, more distinct. It was a woman's voice, unmistakable in its grief. The wails echoed across the mountains, not like the sound of an animal, but as if someone who had been lost for so long, was calling out, reaching for something, or someone. My pulse quickened. I turned, looking behind me. Nothing. The path behind me was empty, the trees just as still and lifeless as they had been moments before. Still, the cries grew louder. It was then that I realized something unsettling. The sound wasn't coming from a specific direction. It seemed to come from everywhere. It was like the mountain itself was alive, its voice echoing off the jagged rocks, winding through the trees, pulling me deeper into the heart of its dark domain. I froze, my breath hitching in my chest. The air had grown colder and I could feel it seeping into my bones, chilling me from the inside out. The warmth of the sun was nowhere to be found, the sky now hidden behind thick clouds, dark and heavy. A cold, suffocating atmosphere settled over me, thick like fog, pressing down on my every movement. The wails continued, sharper now, like a woman crying out in pain and mourning. Her voice trembled with grief, but there was something else in it now, a desperation, a kind of hunger. The more I heard it, the more I could sense that these were no ordinary cries. These weren't the cries of someone who had lost something. These were the cries of someone who wanted something. I took a hesitant step forward, my mind fighting the urge to turn back, to run. But I couldn't stop myself. It was as if the mountain itself was pulling me, urging me to keep moving forward, to chase the sound of that mournful cry, to follow it into the depths of the unknown. But then, just as suddenly as the wails had begun, they stopped. For a moment, the forest fell eerily silent. It was so quiet, the kind of quiet that feels unnatural, oppressive. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. The forest was still, the wind gone, the cries faded into nothing. But I could feel it, something was wrong. A presence, something watching me, lurking just out of sight. I turned again, my eyes scanning the trees, the shadows. But no one was there. Still, the feeling remained, a chilling sense of being followed, of something moving just beyond my reach. My skin prickled, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. I spun around, desperate to find something, anything to explain the feeling gnawing at me. But the mountain remained as still and lifeless as ever. And then, as if the forest had been waiting for that exact moment, the cries came again. This time they were closer. So close, I could almost feel the breath of the woman's voice on my skin. The sound of her wails echoed through the trees, not from the distance, but right beside me, right behind me, in the very air I breathed. I spun around, but there was nothing there, No figure, no shadow, no trace of movement. Yet the cries grew louder, closer, more desperate. It was as if the very mountain had come alive, its soul twisted with the pain of La Llorona, her grief wrapped around the land itself. I could feel her. She was here. And she wasn't alone. A chill that had nothing to do with the air swept over me, a cold that dug deep into my bones. It wasn't just the cries anymore. It was the feeling that something, was standing behind me, watching, waiting. I wasn't alone in these mountains. The wind had picked up again, but this time it felt different, more urgent, as though it was warning me of something. My heart raced as I pressed on through the dense forest, the eerie quiet broken only by the rustling of branches overhead. And then, just as the last echoes of the woman's wails faded into the distance, I saw her. At first, she was just a shadow, a figure in the distance, barely distinguishable from the surrounding darkness of the trees. But even from far away, I could see the unmistakable shape of a woman, her silhouette draped in white. It was a ghostly presence, almost like she belonged to the night itself. I should have turned back then. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to flee back down the path and never look back. But something stopped me. It was a strange pull, a mixture of fear and fascination that rooted me in place. The woman, though far away, seemed so real, so tangible, that it was impossible to look away. I wasn't sure if I was drawn to her by curiosity or if it was something darker, something in the mountain itself that pushed me forward, urging me toward her. The forest around me grew still once more, the wails gone, leaving only the faint sound of my own breathing as I took a step closer. I knew the stories, knew the warnings, but they felt distant now, nothing more than echoes from another life. All that mattered was the figure ahead of me. As I moved closer, her presence grew stronger, more oppressive, like an invisible weight pressing down on my chest. With each step, the figure became clearer. She was standing still, her back to me, her long dark hair cascading down her shoulders like a waterfall of shadow. Her white dress fluttered in the breeze, but there was no movement beyond that. She seemed to be crying softly, her body shaking slightly with each sob. I hesitated for a moment, torn between the urge to turn and run and the compulsion to approach. But I couldn't stop myself. Something deeper than fear, drove me forward, and I found my feet moving on their own, closing the distance between us. As I approached, the air around me grew colder, the atmosphere growing heavier with each step. The woman didn't acknowledge my presence, still lost in her grief. She was beautiful, haunting, but there was something wrong, something out of place in the way she stood there, in the way the mountain seemed to hold its breath as if it were waiting for me to do something, waiting for me to see something I wasn't meant to. Then, without warning, she turned. My blood ran cold as I stared into her face. Her long hair fell around her like a veil, but it couldn't hide the horror beneath. Her face was twisted, a grotesque mask of sorrow and anger, her features distorted by grief. Her eyes, dark, hollow pits of emptiness, stared into mine with an intensity that chilled me to the core. It wasn't just sadness in her eyes, it was something darker, something vengeful. Her mouth opened, and the sound that escaped wasn't a cry of sorrow, but something much more terrifying, a wail that reverberated through the very air, a cry of pain that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. My body froze, my legs unwilling to move, my chest tight with fear as her mournful expression turned into one of pure fury. I felt it then, an overwhelming sense of dread, a knowing that I had just crossed a line I couldn't return from. The stories, the warnings, came crashing back into my mind. La Llorona de la Sierra, the woman in white who haunted these mountains, had found me. She was real. She was here. And she was angry. I wanted to run, to turn around and flee back to the safety of the village, but my feet were frozen in place. Her gaze locked with mine, and for a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in her hollow eyes. Something human, something desperate. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by a void, an emptiness that swallowed everything in its wake. Her lips twisted into a snarl, and in that moment I knew there would be no escape. I had walked into her domain, and now there was no turning back. The moment her twisted, grief-stricken face contorted into that horrific snarl, I felt my heart drop into my stomach. Time seemed to stretch and bend around me, and before I could even comprehend what was happening, she moved. Her feet didn't make a sound, but her presence was unmistakable, like a shadow snapping into focus. She lunged at me with unnatural speed, her long white dress billowing around her, like she was gliding rather than running. I stumbled back, my legs finally responding to the terror that surged through me, but it was too late. Her mournful wail, now no longer soft but piercing, filled the air, echoing off the trees and mountains. It was as though her sorrow had turned to something darker, something more vengeful. Each cry seemed to slice through my skin straight to the bone. She was coming for me, she was coming for revenge. I turned and ran. The ground beneath me felt unstable, as if the earth itself was shifting, making it harder for my feet to find purchase. I could hear her cries growing louder with every step. The air grew colder, so cold that it felt like ice was creeping into my lungs, freezing the very breath I took. And then I realized it wasn't just the wind or the mountain's chill. She was closing in on me. I glanced over my shoulder, heart racing, and saw her again. The woman in white, now closer than ever. Her dark eyes were locked onto mine, a look of pure, unrelenting fury behind her sorrow. She wasn't just chasing me, she was hunting me as though I were prey, and the mountain was her domain. Every step I took seemed to be in vain. The trail ahead of me seemed to blur, to stretch out further than it should have, the path becoming a maze. The trees began to close in, their branches twisting as if they were trying to trap me, to stop me from escaping. I couldn't shake the feeling that the mountain itself had come alive, that it was moving around me, shifting, warping to prevent me from finding a way out. I was running blind, my breaths shallow and frantic, but no matter how fast I moved, no matter how hard I pushed myself, she was always there, closer and closer, her haunting cries growing louder, sharper. I could feel her presence in the air, thick and suffocating, like the world was closing in on me from all sides. The realization hit me with the force of 1,000 blows. The legend was real. La Llorona de la Sierra, the ghostly woman who haunted these mountains, was not just a story to scare children. She was real and she was here. And I had foolishly wandered into her territory. She wasn't just a wandering spirit lost in grief. No, there was something far more terrifying about her. Something darker. She was a force of nature, angry, vengeful, and merciless. And she targeted those who dared to cross her path. Those like me. The ground beneath me buckled, and I nearly lost my footing, my ankle twisting painfully as I stumbled. The mountain itself seemed to rise up against me, forcing me deeper into the maze of trees, further from any hope of escape. I looked over my shoulder again. She was almost upon me, her hair whipping in the wind, her cries now a chorus of fury and grief that threatened to tear me apart. I could feel her gaze on me even without looking. Her eyes, dark, empty, filled with centuries of pain and rage, were seared into my mind. There was no escape. The mountains were shifting and she was a part of them, a part of this cursed land. I needed to run, to survive, but the path ahead was gone. The trees had become a wall, the trail a dead end. My only option was to turn and face her. The woman was now only a few feet away, her outstretched hand reaching toward me, fingers long and twisted, her face a mask of sorrow and rage. I could see the darkness consuming her, the emptiness in her eyes, and I realized that there was no escaping this nightmare. La Llorona de la Sierra was real. She was here. And I had walked straight into her grasp. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat thundering in my ears, and every breath was a desperate gasp for air. I could feel the cold of the mountain creeping into my bones, numbing me, freezing the terror that consumed me. The woman, La Llorona de la Sierra, was so close now, I could hear the rhythm of her steps matching mine, her cold, mournful cries echoing around me like the claws of the mountain itself closing in. I stumbled forward, my mind racing. Where could I go? The trail had disappeared, the path swallowed by the dark, twisted trees that loomed over me like silent, watchful guardians. The mountain had become a maze, and I was lost within its cold embrace. I could feel the weight of her presence closing in, like the walls of the world were pressing in on me, each step making it harder to breathe. But then, through the suffocating darkness, something caught my eye. A faint glow, soft and distant, shone through the trees like a beacon in the night. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A chance. With the last of my strength, I ran toward the light, ignoring the stinging pain in my legs and the way my vision blurred with fear. I had to make it. The wailing cries of La Llorona grew louder, but I pushed forward, praying the light was real, that it wasn't another trick the mountain had set for me. The closer I got, the more I could make out what lay ahead. It was a small, abandoned cabin, nestled in the shadow of the mountain like a forgotten relic. The door was ajar, and the light seemed to be coming from within. It was my only chance. I reached the door and stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me, my chest heaving, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The room was small and dimly lit, with only a single flickering candle on the table. The air inside was thick, almost suffocating, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing. I leaned against the door, my mind racing. Had I lost her? Could I escape? The wails outside grew louder, closer. I could feel her presence even through the thick wooden walls. She was out there. And then the door rattled. It wasn't a wind or an animal, it was her. My heart stopped. A cold, bone-chilling wind blew through the cracks in the cabin, extinguishing the candle in a gust of frigid air. The walls seemed to shake, and I could hear the unmistakable sound of feet dragging across the ground outside. Her cries pierced the silence, louder than ever, filling the cabin like a force of nature, like the very mountain was mourning with her. I backed into a corner, my pulse racing. What could I do? The windows were sealed shut, the door was the only way out. But I couldn't escape. Not now. I had no weapons, no defense, just the cold, oppressive silence of the cabin that seemed to close in on me. The walls were suffocating, and her wailing was unbearable. The door creaked open slowly as if she were savoring the moment. And then, through the dim light, I saw her. La Llorona. She stood in the doorway, her long black hair hanging like a veil of shadows around her face. Her eyes, those empty, dark voids, were fixed on me. She wasn't the woman I'd seen before. No longer simply crying in grief, she was a figure of pure wrath. Her twisted expression, her mouth open in a silent scream, a scream that chilled my soul to its core. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body was frozen, rooted to the floor in terror. And then, with a single step, she was inside the cabin. The end came quickly.